Frank Delaney didn't see the wrench on the floor until it was too late. His right foot caught it just as he leaned forward under the hood of the old Chevy, and before he could even grunt, he was on the ground, hip first, breath knocked clean out of him. A bolt rolled across the concrete like a loose marble, clicking into the silence that followed. The garage light flickered overhead, casting long, trembling shadows on rusted toolboxes and dust-covered shelves. Pain bloomed across his side, sharp and hot, but what scared him most wasn't the fall. It was the way the silence swallowed him afterward. No one heard it. No one was coming. He lay there, staring at the rafters above, tasting copper in his mouth, the edges of his vision fuzzy. 60 seconds passed. Then 2 minutes. Then 5. The air smelled of oil and mildew. Somewhere outside, a lawnmower buzzed distantly like summer was happening for someone else. The radio he'd forgotten to turn off kept humming from the corner, still playing the podcast he'd started before the fall. He hadn't been listening, until a voice broke through. People say you can't change after a certain age. That's a lie. You just stop trying. Frank blinked. The voice was unmistakable, Elon Musk. That clipped cadence, like someone always 5 ideas ahead of where his words could go. I'd rather die trying than live afraid. Frank shifted, grunting as the pain jabbed again, but he was listening now. Really listening. Something about the way the words cut through the stillness made them feel personal, like they were aimed at him specifically, as if Elon was sitting in that dusty garage saying, You still have time. Frank slowly pulled himself up, one hand bracing on the cold steel of the truck's bumper, the other pressing into the concrete floor. Every joint complained. He'd fallen before, getting older did that to a man. But this time, it didn't feel like an accident. It felt like something else. A crack in the routine. A moment that split life into before and after. He limped toward the workbench and shut off the radio, though the words still rang in his head. People say you can't change after a certain age. That's a lie. He glanced at the mirror near the door, one of those old rectangular ones he'd nailed up years ago to check for grease on his face. The man staring back at him looked tired. Liver spots along his jaw. White stubble. Wrinkles that carved deep beneath dull blue eyes. But for the first time in years, he didn't look completely gone. Something flickered there. A dare, maybe. Or defiance. He stepped out into the late afternoon sun, the weight of his body uneven, favoring his left side. The house looked the same as always, quiet, still, a time capsule of when someone used to care. The lawn needed cutting. The mailbox leaned sideways. The porch swing, where his wife once read paperbacks with iced tea by her side, now sagged with dry rot. Frank paused, listening to the wind. It had been years since anyone really needed him. Decades since he'd been called more than Sir or Mr. Delaney by the bank teller or the pharmacist. His daughter called once a month. Maybe. Left messages that always ended with, "You okay, Dad?" He never called back. What was the point? She had her own life. He had his silence. He shuffled into the kitchen, where the coffee pot still held half a cup from the morning. He took a sip, cold, bitter, and leaned against the counter. Musk's words still echoed in his mind. Not because they were wise, necessarily, but because they were absurd. Outrageous. The kind of thing only a man trying to build rockets on a deadline would say. You just stop trying. That part hurt. Because it was true. Somewhere between his wife's death, the retirement party he didn't attend, and the unanswered birthday calls from his grandkids, Frank had stopped trying. The world got faster. He got smaller. He thought he was adapting, but really, he'd been retreating. He looked out the window at the garage. The old truck inside was supposed to be a retirement project, a full restoration. Eleanor, he'd called her. After the car and gone in 60 seconds, but also because that had been his wife's name. He'd meant to finish it before she died. Meant to drive it down the coast like they'd dreamed. Instead, it sat idle for 10 years. A rusting monument to the things he never followed through on. He poured the rest of the cold coffee down the sink, grabbed an ice pack from the freezer, and sat down in the recliner in the living room. His hip throbbed, but not worse than the bruises he already lived with. He turned on the TV. The news, as usual, was noise. Angry panels debating things that didn't matter in his world. He changed the channel. A documentary was running, a replay of something from last year about SpaceX. Rockets landing backwards. Engineers young enough to be his grandchildren solving math problems he couldn't begin to understand. And there was Elon again, walking the launch pad, looking out over something that looked like the future. The narrator said, "Some people see the world for what it is. Musk sees it for what it could be." Frank exhaled through his nose. He wasn't some tech guy. He didn't care about Mars. Hell, he barely checked email. But something about that way of thinking, of refusing to accept limits, that stirred something deeper than logic. It stirred memory. He remembered being 25, standing in front of his first class of students, trying to teach them how to use a bandsaw without losing a finger. He remembered the thrill when a kid finally got it, cut the angle just right. He remembered building things. Fixing things. Feeling like a piece of the world's puzzle. When had that stopped? Not all at once. Not in one dramatic fall. More like dust settling day by day. He reached for his phone and typed Elon Musk quotes into Google. Dozens came up. Some were brash. Some felt insane. But some were like matches on dry paper. When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. Some people don't like change, but you need to embrace change if the alternative is disaster. And this one stayed. Persistence is very important. You should not give up unless you are forced to give up. Frank read it again. Not forced. He hadn't been forced. He had just allowed himself to stop. And now, lying on that garage floor today, he realized how close he was to disappearing altogether. How close he was to never being noticed again. He stood, slower this time, and walked back to the kitchen. The sun was lower now, pouring amber through the back window and lighting up the specks of dust in the air like they were dancing. He opened the junk drawer, rummaged past batteries and receipts, and pulled out a small yellow notebook he hadn't touched in years. Inside were sketches. Measurements. Plans. The last time he'd touched it was the week Eleanor died. A crude drawing of the truck's chassis took up the first page, with notes in the margins: replace frame bolts. Add paneling. His handwriting had looked different then. Sharper. More confident. He flipped the page. A parts list. Numbers scribbled in frustration. Ink smudged where a coffee cup had once rested. And there, at the bottom of the last page, finish it for her. Drive it to the water. He traced that sentence with his finger. Drive it to the water. The lake. That was their place. He hadn't been there in years. He closed the notebook. Looked toward the garage again. Something began to tighten in his chest. Not a panic, not sadness. Something else. A sensation he hadn't felt since before Eleanor's diagnosis. Purpose. Or maybe the first whisper of it. Frank Delaney, 72, bruised and aching, stood with the help of the kitchen counter and looked out into the dusk. He didn't know exactly what came next. But he knew one thing: he wasn't done. Not yet. Maybe he couldn't change the past. Maybe he couldn't outrun time. But maybe, just maybe, he could build something new with what he had left. One bolt at a time. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough. Before everything began to change, Frank Delaney's days unfolded with the predictability of a metronome, each tick marking another loop around the same quiet orbit. He woke at 6:30, whether he wanted to or not, because decades of early mornings didn't loosen their grip just because the clock no longer demanded it. The bed beside him stayed cold, untouched since Eleanor passed 8 years ago, and though he'd thought about changing the sheets once or twice, he couldn't bring himself to disturb the faded floral pillowcase that still held the faintest trace of her scent. He would shuffle to the bathroom, glance at himself in the mirror without looking too hard, splash cold water on his face, and then move to the kitchen, where he made 1 cup of coffee exactly the same way every morning. 2 scoops of grounds, a dash of creamer, and a slow pour into a chipped mug that read, "World's Okayest Dad," a gag gift from his daughter Anna when she was in high school. He always smiled at that mug, but never laughed. The laughter had been packed away, like everything else that reminded him of when he mattered. Breakfast was toast, maybe oatmeal if he felt ambitious, though most mornings he simply sat at the table in silence, the only sound being the slow hum of the fridge and the occasional creak of the house adjusting its old bones. Sometimes he'd glance out the window and see the neighbor kids running to catch the bus, backpacks bouncing, voices full of that light, thoughtless energy that only belongs to the young. He would watch them disappear down the street and think, I used to be part of that rhythm. Used to drive Anna to that same stop. Used to honk the horn and make her laugh when she was late. Used to be someone. After breakfast, he'd check the mailbox, even though the only things he received were medical bills, AARP flyers, and the occasional card from the church down the road reminding him about the pancake breakfast he never attended. On Tuesdays, he went to the grocery store. On Thursdays, he refilled his prescriptions. On Sundays, he sat in the back pew at St. Matthew's and nodded politely to the few people who still remembered his name, though none of them asked more than, "How's your week been?" and moved on before he could answer. Retirement had sounded like freedom once, a long vacation at the edge of life's storm, but for Frank, it had become a waiting room, a place where the clock ticked louder and louder but no one ever called your name. He tried the usual things they tell retired folks to try. He joined a book club but couldn't stomach the small talk. He volunteered once at the library but found himself frustrated by the computer system. He even downloaded an app that claimed to help seniors reimagine their purpose, but it wanted him to create a username and password, and he gave up after 3 tries. The truth was, purpose doesn't come in the form of a program or an online portal. Purpose comes from being needed, from having someone say, "Hey, can you help with this?" And trusting that your answer still matters. No one asked Frank that anymore. Not even Anna. Their relationship had thinned to annual visits and occasional voicemails, each one more strained than the last. She had her own family now, a husband named Derek, 2 boys who played soccer year-round, a mortgage, a career in human resources. She had enough on her plate. Frank didn't blame her. He'd built walls around himself after Eleanor died, and instead of knocking them down, Anna had stopped trying to climb them. The last time they spoke in person was Thanksgiving 2 years ago. He'd made turkey and stuffing, just like Eleanor used to, and set the table with the good china. She showed up late. The kids were glued to their phones. Derek kept checking work emails. Anna had smiled through it all, but at one point, she looked at the half-finished truck in the garage and said, "You still haven't touched that thing, huh?" He'd shrugged. "Maybe one day." She had nodded, said nothing more, and left before dessert. Frank hadn't invited her back since. Not because he was angry. But because disappointment cuts deeper when it comes from someone you love, and he didn't want either of them to feel it again. So the days went on, one bleeding into the next. He watched TV but didn't follow the stories. He read the newspaper but skipped the obituaries, afraid of seeing another name he recognized. He stopped attending his old shop teacher reunions, even though they were now just 3 men and a pitcher of weak beer at Rudy's Tavern. He felt invisible, not in the dramatic sense, not like a ghost, but like a chair no one sits in anymore. Still there, still sturdy, but unnoticed. The worst part of aging, he realized, wasn't the pain or the pills or the way your hands shook when you tried to thread a screw. It was the silence. The long, unbroken stretches of nothing, where your thoughts were your only company, and they mostly circled around what you should have done differently. He thought about the years he spent coaching Anna's softball team, the way she used to light up when he'd cheer from the stands. He thought about the time he and Eleanor drove to New Hampshire on a whim just to see the leaves change, and how she sang to every song on the radio even though she didn't know the words. He thought about the garage, always the garage, and the way he'd started restoring that truck the day he retired, full of plans and motivation, but then Eleanor got sick and everything stopped. She used to come out and sit in a lawn chair while he worked, sipping sweet tea and giving him grief for not wearing gloves. "You'll ruin your hands, Frank," she'd say. "They're already ruined," he'd reply with a grin. He would give anything to hear her say it again. When she passed, something went quiet inside him. Not grief, he could manage grief. He wore it like an old coat, heavy but familiar. No, what settled inside him was something harder to name. A kind of stillness. A belief that the best parts of him had died with her, and all that was left was a man waiting for the calendar to catch up. He kept the house in decent shape. Paid the bills. Took his medication. Smiled politely when neighbors waved. But inside, he was idle. He was storage. He was the spare room people forgot existed until they needed a place to put their junk. He never talked about these things. Not to anyone. Not even to himself, really. They just hovered in the background, like static on an old TV, always there, just quiet enough to ignore. Until that fall in the garage. Until that voice, Musk's voice, cut through the static and said, "You just stop trying." It wasn't the kind of motivational poster nonsense that people posted online and forgot a minute later. It was confronting. Like someone shining a flashlight into a basement you hadn't visited in years. Frank hadn't stopped because he was too old. He hadn't stopped because he couldn't. He had stopped because he believed the world didn't need him anymore, and that belief had grown roots. But what if it was wrong? What if, instead of waiting to be needed, he just started doing something again? What if he picked up the wrench, not because it would lead to some grand achievement, but because it used to make him feel alive? That night, after the fall, after the ice pack and the ache and the echoes of those words, Frank sat in his recliner and pulled out a notebook he hadn't opened in years. Inside were sketches, old designs, ideas he once had for modifications to the truck. His own notes made him smile. Need better carb. Replace rotors. Maybe get Anna to help with wiring, she was always good at that. He traced those words with his finger, and for the first time in years, he felt something stir. Not hope, exactly. Not yet. But interest. Curiosity. The faintest echo of the man he used to be. He stayed up past midnight, flipping through pages, scribbling notes. And before he went to bed, he walked to the garage, stood in the doorway, and whispered into the darkness, "Tomorrow." Just that. One word. But it meant something. It meant he hadn't given up. Not yet. It meant the story wasn't over. The next morning, Frank woke up to a stiffness in his side that reminded him he'd hit the garage floor less than 24 hours ago, but there was also something else, something unfamiliar and oddly energizing, a sense of direction. It wasn't quite clarity, not yet, but it was sharper than the blur he usually moved through. He sat up slowly, rubbed his hands down his face, and for the first time in what felt like forever, made the bed. It didn't look great, the corners weren't tight, and the pillows sagged like old knees, but he stood back and looked at it and nodded. It was something. He showered, made coffee, and skipped the toast. Instead, he opened the notebook again, the one with the Eleanor Project sketches, and stood by the window with it in his hands. The truck sat still in the garage, quiet, untouched, but now it didn't look like a tombstone anymore, it looked like a starting line. The first test came before noon. He drove to the hardware store, mostly to look around and maybe pick up some cleaner for the engine block, but as soon as he pulled into the lot and saw the rows of shiny sedans and young people in logoed vests jogging carts across the pavement, he hesitated. He stayed in the car for a minute, the engine running, staring at the sliding doors. That familiar voice crept in, the one that said, "You'll just embarrass yourself. You'll ask a question they don't know how to answer because they're 20 and have never fixed anything without YouTube. You'll be the old guy in the way." But then another voice, calmer, firmer, replied, "So what? You're here, aren't you? Isn't that already different than yesterday?" He turned off the car, stepped out, and walked through those sliding doors like a man with a mission. The clerk in the automotive section looked like he had barely finished high school, but Frank asked him about degreaser and rust inhibitors anyway, listened to the suggestions, and nodded. The kid was polite, didn't talk down to him, and even asked, "What are you working on?" Frank smiled, really smiled. "Restoring a '72 Chevy C10, he said. The kid's eyes lit up. Man, that's a classic. That small exchange shouldn't have meant much, but to Frank it felt like someone had unlocked a window in a room that had been sealed shut. He left with a bag of supplies and a sudden urge to stop for lunch, something he hadn't done since Eleanor died. He pulled into a small diner near the edge of town, one he used to take Anna to when she was little. It hadn't changed much. Same cracked vinyl booths, same chipped salt shakers, same waitress behind the counter with the beehive hairdo. She didn't recognize him, but that didn't matter. He ordered a BLT and sat by the window, sketching in the notebook while he waited. A thought kept bouncing around in his head like a dropped socket wrench. What if he could actually do this? Not just pick at the truck, but finish it. What if, instead of letting the days pass like sand through a sieve, he turned them into bricks and built something with them? He was scribbling an idea for an upgraded suspension when his phone buzzed. A voicemail. Anna. His first instinct was to ignore it, let it sit unread like the others, but something stopped him. He opened the message and hit play. Her voice came through the speaker, hesitant, cautious. "Hey, Dad. I saw something today that reminded me of you. A man was fixing an old car in his driveway and I thought about that time we rebuilt the go-kart together. Remember that? I think I was 9. I don't know. Anyway, I hope you're okay. Just checking in." Frank didn't move. For a long moment, he stared at the phone, her voice still echoing inside him. He could see it, clear as day, Anna in the driveway, hair in a ponytail, grease on her cheek, beaming as they took their first test drive around the cul-de-sac. She was fearless back then. And she looked at him like he could do anything. When had that changed? When had he stopped being someone she believed in? Was it when Eleanor got sick and he closed himself off? When he refused help? When he started saying, "I'm fine," instead of, "I need you"? He wanted to call her back right then, say something, anything, but the words didn't come. Instead, he saved the message and tucked the phone away like it was made of glass. Back home, he spent the afternoon in the garage, slowly but deliberately clearing off the workbench. Dust rose in clouds, tools clinked as he sorted them, and by the time the sun began to dip below the tree line, he had created a small, sacred space again. He placed the notebook on the corner, opened to the original sketch of the truck, and stared at it. Then, with a quiet sense of ceremony, he pulled a Sharpie from the drawer and wrote one word across the top, "Begin." That night, he skipped TV. Instead, he pulled up an old YouTube interview with Elon Musk, one he remembered seeing clips of but had never watched in full. It was long, over an hour, and filmed in a warehouse full of engine prototypes and electric batteries. The interviewer asked, "What do you say to people who think it's too late to start something new?" Elon had paused, then said, "The moment you decide to do something meaningful, that's your beginning. Doesn't matter how old you are, or how late it is. Most people are waiting for permission that never comes." Frank sat with that line for a long time. Waiting for permission. That's what he'd been doing, wasn't it? Waiting for someone to say, "You're allowed to still matter." But maybe no one was going to say it. Maybe he had to say it to himself. The next morning, he went for a walk. His hips still ached, but the stiffness wasn't as sharp. The air was crisp, the sun just beginning to break over the tops of the sycamore trees that lined his street. He passed the empty lot where the old hardware store used to be, and then the bench where Eleanor liked to read on cool spring afternoons. He stopped there, just for a moment, and whispered, "I'm starting, Elle." Finally. It felt ridiculous. And also necessary. By the time he returned home, he had made a list of what the truck needed: body work, wiring, upholstery, the engine rebuilt or maybe even replaced. It would take time, money, effort, but he had time. And as for money, well, he'd saved more than he needed because he'd never spent it. Maybe this was the thing it was meant for. Over the next few days, Frank began carving out a routine. Mornings in the garage, afternoons researching. He read about electric vehicle conversions, just to see if it was possible. The tech was complicated, sure, but the idea of making the truck more than it had been started to appeal to him. Not just restore the past, but reimagine it. He even downloaded a podcast about renewable energy, hosted by a group of young engineers who didn't sound like they were trying to sell anything, just trying to understand how to fix the world. It was strange, how the voices of young people, voices he'd once tuned out as noise, were now inspiring him. Maybe because they sounded like they still believed in things. Or maybe because they reminded him that belief itself was a kind of fuel. One night, after a particularly long stretch of sanding down a rusted panel, Frank sat on the tailgate with a beer in hand and looked at the stars. He thought about the way Elon Musk had once said, "Failure is an option here. If things are not failing, you are not innovating enough." That was it, wasn't it? The fear of failure had been stopping him for years. But now, for reasons he couldn't fully explain, he wasn't afraid of failing anymore. He was afraid of standing still. Retirement hadn't been a reward, it had been a slow fading. But maybe that was just the version everyone expected him to live. Maybe he could write a different one. He took one more sip, set the bottle down, and whispered to the sky, "Let's see what happens." The first real change didn't announce itself with fireworks or fanfare. It began with a single bolt, rusted and stubborn, stuck deep beneath the truck's front wheel well. Frank had stared at it for 20 minutes, tried every wrench in the drawer, and even considered giving up and calling it a day. But instead of walking away, he did something unfamiliar. He tried again. He soaked it with oil, waited 10 more minutes, braced his arm, and gave it one more twist. It snapped loose with a screech, and he let out a surprised, satisfied laugh that startled even himself. That small victory set the tone. The next day, it was the carburetor, stripped and cleaned. Then it was the rusted chrome around the headlights, polished until the metal shone. One task became two. Two became four. Each one wasn't monumental in itself, but together they formed something larger, momentum. And it wasn't just in the garage. He started walking every morning, even when his knees complained. He waved at neighbors and didn't lower his eyes when they waved back. He replied to one of Anna's texts, just a simple, "Hey, got your message. Hope you're doing okay. I'm working on something." She didn't respond right away, but that was fine. For the first time in years, he wasn't watching the phone like it held his worth. He was moving again. Living forward. At the grocery store, a man about his age noticed the grease under Frank's nails and said, "Working on something?" Frank replied without hesitation, "Yeah, my old C10. Trying to bring her back to life." The man smiled, nodded, and said, "Wish I had the energy for that." Frank almost replied, "I don't," but stopped himself. Because the truth was, he did. Not physical energy, maybe, he still had to ice his knees and take breaks more often than he liked, but a different kind of energy, the kind that comes from purpose. That spark that had gone cold for so long was catching flame again. One afternoon, while rummaging through the attic for some old replacement parts, Frank found a photo album Eleanor had put together during their road trip years. Inside was a picture he hadn't seen in decades, the two of them standing beside a different truck, younger and sunburned, smiling like fools near the edge of a rocky overlook. Her arm was around his waist. His eyes were squinting into the sun, and she was laughing at something he'd said just before the shutter clicked. He touched the image gently, running his thumb over the glossy surface. "We're getting there, Elle," he whispered. That night, the podcast he listened to featured a guest who talked about starting second acts, how the brain doesn't stop growing just because society tells you it should. The biggest lie about aging, the guest said, is that your best work is behind you. It's not. It's just that no one expects anything from you anymore, and that expectation, or lack of it, becomes a cage. That hit Frank harder than he expected. No one expected anything from him. Not his neighbors. Not Anna. Not even himself. And that had become his reality, day after day, until now. Now, the act of expecting something of himself, even just finishing the truck, was breaking that cage one bar at a time. He began documenting the process, at first with notes in his old yellow notebook, then, after some trial and error, with photos on his phone. He created a folder labeled Project Eleanor. He even flirted with the idea of sharing the progress online, though the idea made him feel exposed. Who would care? But a part of him knew that someone might. Maybe another old man in another garage. Maybe a younger version of himself, lost and unsure. Maybe Anna. One evening, he sat down and filmed a short video on his phone. Just him, in the garage, standing beside the truck, explaining what he was doing. "Hey," he said awkwardly, "I'm Frank. This is Eleanor. I'm 72 years old and I've decided I'm not done yet." Thought maybe somebody out there needed to hear that. He watched it back. It was shaky, the lighting was terrible, and he stumbled over his words. But it was real. He posted it to YouTube under a username he made up on the spot, Second Wind Frank. He figured no one would see it. But it felt good to send it out anyway. Like tossing a message in a bottle. The next morning, the video had 12 views. By the end of the week, it had 3,000. Most of the comments were simple: "Good for you, this gave me hope, my dad needs to see this," but one stood out. It said, "You're proving it's never too late to start again. Subscribed." That comment stayed with him. He began making more videos, not polished, not scripted, just moments of honesty in the garage, working through each step, talking about the process, the memories, the setbacks. He didn't try to teach or preach. He just shared. People started responding. Younger folks, older folks, even a few women who wrote things like, "Reminds me of my dad." He gave up too soon. Somewhere along the way, his channel passed 10,000 subscribers. One of the local news stations reached out for a segment. They asked to come film him working, and he almost said no. But then he thought of what Elon might say, that comfort zones are where dreams go to die. So he said yes. When the news crew arrived, Frank stood proudly beside the half-finished truck, his tools laid out neatly, his hands black with grease. The interviewer asked him what inspired him to start again, and he didn't hesitate. "I heard something that shook me up," he said. "Someone said, 'You just stopped trying.' And I realized that's what I'd done. I stopped trying. But I'm trying now. And that's what matters." The segment aired the following week. Frank didn't watch it live, but Anna did. She called him that night. Not a voicemail. A real call. "Dad," she said, her voice thick, "I saw the story. I'm proud of you." He didn't know what to say. He swallowed hard. "Thanks, sweetheart. That means more than you know." They talked for 30 minutes. Then 40. Then over an hour. They made plans for her to visit, maybe bring the boys. Maybe help him with the wiring, like old times. After the call ended, Frank sat in the garage for a long time, staring at the truck under the hanging light bulb. It still needed work, plenty of it. But now, every dent and bolt had a new weight to it. He wasn't just restoring a machine. He was restoring a connection. A purpose. A life. The garage smelled of motor oil and sweat, and the radio played soft blues in the background. He wiped his hands on a rag and whispered, "We're just getting started." The one thing he changed wasn't the truck. It wasn't even the decision to start again. The one thing he changed was belief. Belief that he wasn't too old. That it wasn't too late. That he could still build something that mattered. And in doing that, everything else began to follow. Frank couldn't stop smiling the morning Anna pulled into the driveway. Her SUV was newer, sleek, spotless, and a world apart from the old truck that sat like a rusted monument in the garage behind him, but to Frank, that SUV might as well have been a spaceship. He stood there with his arms crossed, not sure if he should wave or walk forward or just wait, but when the doors opened and she stepped out, followed by the two grandkids he barely knew, the decision was made for him. "Hey, Dad," she said, a little cautiously at first, like they were trying out new shoes after years of going barefoot around each other. He nodded and tried to speak, but his throat had tightened, so he simply opened his arms. She stepped into them, and suddenly, they weren't father and daughter strained by years of silence, they were just family again, holding on like people who remembered they belonged. The boys were hesitant. Tim, the older one, about 12, gave a half wave and said, "Hey, Grandpa," like it was a test. The younger one, Charlie, held close to Anna but peeked up with curiosity. Frank crouched slowly, the stiffness in his knees flaring, and smiled. "You two ever helped fix a real truck before?" Their eyes lit up, and Frank didn't need a bigger invitation. The garage became the center of their day, their temporary kingdom. Anna looked around as they stepped inside, the musty scent of oil, metal, and memory thick in the air. "It still smells the same," she said, half laughing. "Exactly like I remember." Frank handed Tim a wrench and pointed at the battery bracket. "Think you can loosen that bolt?" Tim gave a determined nod. Charlie watched from the edge, then shuffled closer. Anna walked over to the workbench, picked up the old notebook with Eleanor's sketch, and flipped through the pages with a quiet reverence. "You kept all of this?" Frank shrugged, but inside he felt like his chest might cave in. "Couldn't throw it out. She helped me dream this whole thing up. Just took me a while to get moving." Anna touched one of the pages and smiled. "I remember this drawing. You made me color it when I was sick with the flu. I stayed home from school and you told me trucks need personality. I gave it pink tires and a rocket booster." Frank laughed, really laughed, and it echoed off the garage walls like music returning to an old dance hall. "I should have listened. Might have finished this thing 20 years ago." The afternoon passed in a blur of grease, tools, and the kind of conversations that sneak in sideways when you're not looking for them. Charlie eventually picked up a rag and started wiping down the headlights with the earnest focus of a kid doing something important. Tim asked if they could come back again the next weekend. Frank nodded without hesitation. "If you do, we're installing the new alternator. That's big-time stuff." Anna sat on a stool near the door, watching her sons and her father, her eyes misty. "You know," she said softly, "I always wondered why you stopped talking about this truck. It used to be all you talked about." Frank paused, then sat down across from her. "When your mom got sick, I think I just froze. Everything I wanted to build stopped mattering if she wasn't going to be there to see it." Anna nodded, understanding blooming between them like spring breaking through frost. "I think I stopped asking because I thought maybe it hurt too much." He reached across the gap and gently squeezed her hand. "It did. But now, doing this, having you all here, it feels like breathing again. That night, after they'd gone, Frank sat in the kitchen, sipping tea instead of beer, his body aching in all the old familiar places, but his spirit lighter than it had been in years. The garage was quiet again, but it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt alive. He pulled out his phone and recorded a new video. This one wasn't about tools or updates. He sat in his chair and looked into the camera with a softness that came from somewhere deep and old. I used to think time was my enemy, he began. I thought every year that passed meant I was getting farther from the man I used to be. But now I see it different. Time gave me something. Perspective. Patience. A reason to try again. My daughter came home today. My grandsons helped me work on Eleanor. And for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm not just existing. I'm living. I'm telling you this in case you're where I was. If you're sitting in your house thinking it's too late, that no one's watching, that nothing you do matters anymore, let me tell you something. It does. You do. Pick one thing. Just one. And start. You might be surprised who shows up when you do. He posted it and went to bed, expecting nothing. But by the next morning, the video had gone viral. Over 200,000 views. Thousands of comments. People from all over the country, heck, even the world, writing things like, "This made me cry, I showed this to my dad, my grandpa is digging out his old tool kit, subscribed, second wind Frank, you give me hope." A week later, an email arrived. It was from a young producer with a podcast called Modern Legends, asking if Frank would be willing to do an interview. Frank didn't know what to say. Him? A legend? But the producer insisted, said Frank's story was inspiring people in ways they couldn't have predicted. He said Elon Musk had even liked one of the videos, shared it with a caption, "It's never too late to build." Frank stared at that for a long time. Elon Musk. The man who'd once built rockets and laughed at failure. Liking his story. Sharing his words. It was surreal. Not because he wanted fame. That was never the point. But because the spark that changed everything had come full circle. From Musk's voice in a video to Frank's hands in the garage, to his story reaching someone else like him, lost in silence and time, waiting for permission to start again. And now he could be the spark. The fire. The voice. The day the podcast aired, Frank sat with his phone clutched in both hands. The host introduced him as, a man who proves that legacy isn't what you leave behind, it's what you build right up until your final breath. Frank told stories about Eleanor, about the truck, about falling in the garage and hearing that one line, "You just stop trying." He talked about what came after. The fear. The doubt. The first turn of the wrench. And then, the rebuilding. Not just of a truck. Of himself. When the episode ended, the host asked, "What's next for Frank Delaney?" Frank didn't hesitate. "I finished the truck. I drive it to the overlook where I proposed to Eleanor. And maybe I keep building after that. Something new. Doesn't matter what. As long as I don't stop trying." That night, a message came through from a man in Nebraska. "I'm 81. Lost my wife last year. Watched all your videos. Started cleaning out my workshop for the first time in years. You gave me something back I didn't know I'd lost. Thank you, Frank." Frank wrote back, "You gave yourself that. I just reminded you it was possible." He sat on the back porch under the stars, the wind rustling the trees, the scent of oil and sawdust still clinging to his shirt. The truck wasn't finished yet. But it would be. And now, he wasn't doing it alone. He was part of something. A movement, maybe. A quiet rebellion against the lie that age is an ending. It wasn't. It was a chapter. One you got to write. One wrench at a time. It was a warm Friday morning when Frank heard the knock on the garage door, not the usual ding of a delivery or the casual visit of a neighbor, but a real knock, firm and deliberate. He was under Eleanor's frame at the time, inspecting the front axle and murmuring about the steering column, when the sound made him freeze, then scoot backward on his creeper with a slow hiss of air. Wiping his hands on a rag, he walked over to the side door, pulled it open, and blinked against the sunlight, and that's when he saw him. At first, Frank thought it was a joke. A look-alike, maybe, or someone filming a prank. But no, the man standing before him, lean, slightly hunched from long workdays, hair tousled in that signature way, was unmistakably Elon Musk. Wearing jeans and a black t-shirt, he looked more like a startup intern than the richest man on earth, but it was him. And he was smiling. "Frank Delaney, right?" Elon said, offering a hand. Frank blinked, then nodded, gripping the hand that had once launched cars into space. "That's me," he said, his voice catching. "Unless I'm dreaming." Elon chuckled. "You're not. I was in the area for a project and told my assistant I wanted to meet the guy who reminded half the country that getting old doesn't mean giving up. You've got fans in my office, you know. Your story, well, it hit home for more people than you think." Frank stepped back, still trying to process the moment, and motioned him inside the garage. "Come on in. Can't offer you champagne, but I've got coffee and WD-40. Elon laughed again, stepping inside and immediately taking in the scene, tools organized along pegboards, engine parts on tarps, the stripped-down beauty of Eleanor mid-transformation. "She's a beauty," he said. "What year?" 72. "Eleanor was my wife's favorite truck," Frank said, watching Elon walk around the vehicle like a museum curator. "She passed 3 years ago. I guess I did too, in a way. Took a video of you to wake me back up." Elon turned and nodded, serious now. "It was the quote, wasn't it? You just stopped trying. I said that a few years back. Funny how something offhand can end up meaning everything to someone else." Frank leaned against the workbench, nodding slowly. "That line, it wasn't just words. It was a mirror. I realized I'd quit, just not all at once. It happens in small ways. You stop fixing things. Then you stop calling people. Then you start thinking maybe it's all downhill and you don't even realize you're already at the bottom." Elon was quiet for a second, then said, "I've spent my life pushing boundaries, tech, space, energy, but what you did, turning your life around after all that time, that's just as important. People think you need youth to start over. You proved them wrong. That's the kind of innovation nobody talks about." Frank couldn't help it, he laughed, shaking his head. "You're standing in my garage calling me innovative. I should have worn a nicer shirt." Elon smiled. "I didn't come to talk business. I came to say thank you. And maybe lend a hand, if you'll have me. I'm good with motors, you know." Frank arched an eyebrow, half joking. "You build rockets. Think you can handle a carburetor?" "Try me," Elon said. For the next 3 hours, they worked side by side. At first, it felt surreal, Frank watching Elon Musk torque bolts and ask for a socket wrench, but soon it felt natural. They talked between tasks, slipping into a rhythm. Frank told stories about the early days with Eleanor, road trips with Anna, the way the truck used to backfire like a cannon in the winter. Elon shared stories from his own life, unexpected failures, moments of doubt, the nights he'd sleep in the Tesla factory just to meet deadlines. "People think I never stop moving because I'm chasing money," he said, tightening a clamp. "But that's not it. I just hate waste. Wasted time, wasted talent, wasted potential. I guess that's why your story hit me so hard. You reclaimed something most people just leave behind." Frank nodded. "We're taught that the world doesn't need us after a certain age. Like we've already had our time and should just make room. But I've found there's a whole other life waiting if you just crack it open." As the afternoon sun stretched shadows across the driveway, Elon stepped back, wiped his hands, and admired their progress. You ever think about turning this into something bigger? Workshops? Talks? Helping other people find their spark again? Frank chuckled. Me? Talk in front of people? Elon gave him a look. You've already talked to millions. Your videos? They're doing more than you realize. Frank considered that. Not with fear this time, but with curiosity. Maybe, he said. I always thought all I had to offer was behind me. But now, maybe there's more gas in the tank. Elon grinned. That's the spirit. And when you finish this truck, I've got a team that can help you convert her to electric. Just say the word. Frank blinked. You serious? Absolutely. Think about it, restoring the past while preparing for the future. Kind of poetic, don't you think? Frank nodded slowly. Yeah. I do. They shook hands at the edge of the driveway as the light softened and the cicadas began to sing. Thanks for coming, Frank said. I still don't know if this is real. Elon smiled. It's real. And you're doing more than fixing a truck. You're showing the rest of us what comes next. Then he was gone, stepping into a simple black sedan, leaving behind only the scent of ambition and engine grease. That night, Frank sat in the garage, staring at Eleanor under the warm glow of a single bulb, everything quiet except the soft ticking of the cooling metal. He thought about Elon's words, about making something bigger than just a project, and felt something stir in him, a calling, maybe. He'd started this journey for himself, but now, maybe it wasn't just about him anymore. He pulled out his phone and hit record. Today something happened I never thought possible. Elon Musk came to my house. My garage. He helped me work on Eleanor. I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. But what really struck me wasn't the visit, it was what he said. That maybe what I'm doing here could become more. That maybe sharing this journey isn't just about fixing something broken, it's about helping others fix themselves too. So here's what I want to ask you, whoever's watching. What's the thing you gave up on? The project? The dream? The relationship? What's the thing you left behind because you thought you didn't have time or strength or permission to try again? Find it. Pick it up. Dust it off. Start again. You're not too old. You're just early for your next chapter. He ended the video, uploaded it, and stared at the blinking screen. The journey that began with a fall in a dusty garage was now reaching farther than he ever imagined. And the road ahead, instead of narrowing, was opening wider than he thought possible. The next morning, Frank awoke before sunrise, not because of stiffness in his back or the usual ache in his hips, but because something deep in his chest told him it was time. He moved through the house with purpose, brushing his teeth in the dim bathroom light, brewing a pot of coffee that filled the kitchen with its rich, earthy scent, and staring out the window as the sky shifted from black to soft gray, then pale gold. Eleanor sat in the garage like she always had, but now she was more than a shell. She was nearly whole, wheels balanced, the new engine in place, the frame repainted with that deep, midnight blue he'd picked out just weeks earlier, the same color as the sky on the night he proposed to Eleanor out near Lake Meredith. The new seats were wrapped in vintage-style leather, a gift from a retired upholsterer who had seen Frank's story and offered to help, just for the honor of being part of something real. The dashboard still needed polish, and there were wires that needed tying off, but for all intents and purposes, the truck could move again. It was roadworthy. It was ready. Frank stood at the threshold of the garage, sipping his coffee and staring at her, overwhelmed not by pride but by something quieter, gratitude, reverence, maybe even disbelief. He reached out, ran his hand along the curve of the fender, and said aloud, "Let's go see her." He wasn't talking to Eleanor the truck. He was talking to Eleanor the woman. The woman who sat with him on cold nights, dreaming about what they'd build when life slowed down. The woman who laughed like she knew how short life was and loved like she wasn't afraid of anything. She was gone, but she wasn't gone. Not really. He could feel her in every bolt, every coat of paint, every turn of the wrench that brought this old dream back to life. He pulled on his work jacket, opened the garage door, and climbed into the driver's seat. His knees complained, but his spirit soared. His hand gripped the wheel with a steadiness he hadn't felt in years. When he turned the key, Eleanor roared to life, not perfectly, but with enough confidence to echo through the quiet neighborhood like a memory reborn. He backed out slowly, waving to a neighbor walking his dog, who paused and gave a thumbs up. Frank returned it with a smile, then turned down the street, heading west toward the edge of town. The air rushed in through the open window, warm with late summer promise, and every bump in the road reminded him that this wasn't just about getting somewhere, it was about being awake again. He passed familiar spots, the barber shop that still had his picture on the wall from the time he got a buzz cut after losing a bet, the diner where he and Eleanor used to share pie and coffee on Sunday afternoons, the high school where Anna once played trumpet so loudly the principal came out to watch. Everything looked the same but different, as if the whole town had been waiting for him to notice it again. 25 miles outside of town, the road curved up toward the overlook. The trees gave way to open sky, and Frank felt his chest tighten, not from fear or age, but from the emotion pressing against his ribs like it had been bottled for too long. When he reached the top, he pulled off to the same gravel patch where he and Eleanor had parked that night so many years ago. The view was still stunning, the lake in the distance shimmering like a sheet of glass, the hills stretching out in soft waves, the skies so wide it felt like a second ocean. He turned off the engine and sat there, hands on the wheel, eyes full. "I made it," he whispered. "Took a little longer than we planned, but I got here." He reached into the glove box and pulled out a folded piece of paper, a letter he'd written months ago but never read aloud. He unfolded it with care, smoothing the edges, and began to speak. "Dear Elle, I know I should have written sooner, but I didn't know what to say. You were always the one who saw the future when I was stuck in the past. I couldn't see it without you. I couldn't even move. But something changed. One night, I fell, and instead of laying there waiting, I got up. Not just off the floor. Off the ground I'd been stuck on for years. I heard a voice that shook me loose. It wasn't yours, but it reminded me of you, of how you used to challenge me, push me, believe in me. And I started again. I turned a wrench. I turned on the light. I turned toward the life I'd been ignoring. You're in every part of this truck. And now, maybe, I'm starting to feel like I'm in it too. Not the old me, the man who lost you, but the man who's still becoming something. Still building. Still dreaming. I miss you every single day, but I think maybe that's okay. Because missing you means I'm still reaching for something good." He wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his jacket, then carefully folded the letter and placed it beneath the sun visor, like an offering. He stepped out of the truck and walked to the edge of the overlook, the wind brushing his face, rustling his hair. The horizon stretched out in front of him, not as a reminder of what was lost, but as a promise of what still remained. On the drive home, he didn't take the highway. He took back roads. Stopped at a roadside fruit stand. Talked to a couple who said they'd seen his story online and asked to take a photo with him. "You're inspiring people like us," the woman said. "My husband just pulled his old motorcycle out of storage. Says it's your fault." Frank laughed, heart light. "Tell him I said to check the oil first." That night, when he pulled Eleanor back into the garage, he didn't feel like he was parking an old truck. He felt like he was returning a vessel that had carried him somewhere sacred. He stood beside her, ran a hand along the roof, and whispered, "Thank you." He checked his phone, over 500 new comments on his latest video. A message from a woman in Oregon saying her mother started painting again after watching him. A veteran in Texas who rebuilt a tractor because Frank did it, so I figured I could too. The world, it seemed, had been quietly waiting for permission. Waiting for someone like him to remind them that aging wasn't retreat, it was evolution. He sat down in the garage chair, turned on the camera again, and said, "I went to the place where it all started for me today. And you know what? It didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning. A new one. We get told that once we hit a certain age, life's about slowing down, stepping aside. But I've learned something lately: age doesn't steal your power, it just makes you think you don't have any left. You do. We all do. Whatever it is you stopped doing because you thought your time was up, I want you to look at it again. Pick it up. Reclaim it. Build it, fix it, paint it, write it, call it. Whatever it is, do it. Don't wait to feel ready. Start now. Because every day you wait is a day you never get back. And the truth about aging? They never told us we could still begin." He ended the video, uploaded it, and looked at Eleanor, then at the stars beginning to prick the sky. Somewhere out there, maybe Elon Musk was staring at a blueprint or a launch pad. And here, in this little garage, Frank Delaney was doing something just as bold, living forward. The following morning felt charged, though the sun rose exactly as it always does, soft gold spilling through the blinds into Frank's kitchen. He made coffee, black this time, and lingered by the window watching a cardinal land on the feeder out front. The world looked ordinary, but everything had shifted for him. His phone buzzed 15 minutes later, notifications, comments, messages. People across the country replying to his overnight post, went to the overlook. Feels like a beginning, tagging friends, sharing memories, saying he reminded them of someone they lost or loved. He scrolled slowly, humbled and stunned. He'd only intended to share one moment. Now, whole lives were showing up. He sat for a while before going out to the garage, brewed motivation in every heartbeat. Climbing into Eleanor felt sacred now. He slipped the letter from beneath the visor into his coat pocket, never to be forgotten, but hidden again. He had work to do. Over the next week, he tightened bolts, ran wires, configured battery mounts. He measured and remeasured, consulted diagrams online, even rewatched tutorials Elon had recommended in a reply to his earlier tweet: "Age doesn't limit you, fear does." The electric conversion kit sat on the bench, unopened, a silent invitation and challenge. He called Tyler, young neighbor who had helped him months ago, and asked if he wanted to come Saturday to help polish headlight bezels. The boy's voice crackled with excitement. He brought his older sister along, grumpy at first, then captivated when she saw Frank's meticulous care. Their mother brought lemon bars as thanks. Over lunch in the garage, they all ate at the folding table, swapping stories. Frank told them about Anna's message monitoring his interview. Tyler talked about his dream of being an auto mechanic at a real shop. His sister confessed she'd never been interested in cars until she saw Frank turning wrenches at 72. They left with hugs and promises to return. That afternoon, a journalist from the county paper called asking for an interview. "Your story is inspiring people from coast to coast, Mr. Delaney. We'd love to come and see how things are going." Frank agreed, though he was nervous, not because of his age, but because moments like these felt too big for a man who began the week tightening a bolt. The reporter's video aired that evening on the local news, Frank working under Eleanor's hood, the lens catching speckles of paint and beads of sweat. He said into the camera, "So many people let their story end because someone told them they were done before they really were. I got tired of waiting for permission. So I gave myself some. And I think we all deserve that chance." The anchor ended with, "If you're looking for proof that passion has no age limit, meet Frank Delaney." The piece closed with a shot of his channel on the back window, "Second Wind Frank." Anna watched it from her living room and called again that night. This time she stayed longer, asking about the truck's progress, about Tyler, about how he felt combining old and new, oil and electrons. She told him the boys loved being there. Anna mentioned she'd shared a few of his videos with friends at her office who were caregiving older relatives. They were moved. Frank listened, grateful for the quiet strength of reconnection, as if the distance of years had softened just enough to let light through. That night, he filmed again, updating the channel on recent progress, the interactions with locals, the near-final assembly of the rear axle. He shot the electric conversion parts laid out on a towel, called it Eleanor 2.0, powered by possibility. He ended with a question to the viewers: what's your next tool? What project are you dusting off this week? I hope you find it and start. The next morning, responses poured in. People shared pics of garage projects, writing desks, kitchen remodels, even a woman in Florida starting to repaint a neglected porch. A man from Illinois shared a photo of an old wheelchair ramp he built to help his neighbor get to her front door. A subscriber wrote from Colorado, "I'm 69. Today I called the college and signed up for guitar lessons." Messages weren't just about projects, they were about permission. People said, "If Frank can do it at 72, maybe I can too." In the middle of those messages, one came through that made Frank pause, an email from a nonprofit focused on senior living empowerment. They asked if he would speak at their annual conference about pursuing purpose later in life. He wasn't sure he belonged on stage in front of a crowd he'd never met. But he thought about Elon saying people inside his company thought his project mattered, that innovation was more than rockets, it was reclaiming life. He thought about the man in Nebraska who'd rebuilt a tractor. He thought about Anna's voice soft with pride. He thought about Tyler's sisters watching him work. And he thought, maybe someone needed to hear truth, not theory, that it's never too late to build forward. So he said yes. The nonprofit sent him questions: what inspired you? What did you learn about aging? What advice would you give someone watching this at home? Frank wrote back slowly. He didn't have slick bullet points or motivational slogans. But he had what he felt: honesty. He wrote about Eleanor and the truck and being stuck under the weight of memory. He wrote about falling, literally, and hearing a line that felt like a purpose shift. He wrote about failing small and succeeding even though bodies hurt. He wrote about belief, the easiest thing to lose, the hardest to get back. A few nights later, he rehearsed in the garage by himself. He stood in front of Eleanor as if it were a stage, then pressed record. "Hello, everyone. I'm the guy who no one expected to do anything. Let me tell you something they don't tell you about aging: nothing miraculous happens unless you begin again. Not tomorrow. Not when the pain goes away. Not after you hear from someone you lost. Now. Start now." He smiled, vulnerable and sure. He stopped the video, closed his eyes, and exhaled like a man who'd just let fear out of the room. A week later, at the conference, he stood under a spotlight in a chilly auditorium in Chicago. The audience was older than the people who watched his videos. Many leaned forward, faces lined with quiet hope. When he began to speak, he told them the story, but shorter. The fall. The quote. The truck. The reconnect. The community. He didn't go for applause. He went for presence. Eyes glistened. Some hands came together. He asked, "What was your Eleanor? What project or person or dream do you think is too late for?" I'll tell you, it's not. It's never too late. Afterward, people lined up. One woman, 80 and using a cane, said she was going to finish the quilt she started for her granddaughter 10 years ago. A man in his 60s said he wanted to reopen his old bakery. A daughter of a grandson said her grandma had tears in her eyes. Each time someone thanked him, he felt the weight of what one bolt can start. Back home, when he stepped into the garage, exhaustion met him. But the kind that comes from using strength you didn't think you had. Eleanor sat under the light, electric kit still waiting, many wires dangling. Frank ran his fingers across the fender and said into the stillness, "Sometimes hope isn't a feeling. It's a decision. Today I decided again." He pulled out his phone and shot a final clip, a quiet close-up of Eleanor's rear wheel hub and the new EV badge stuck on it. Eleanor is not done yet. Neither are we. He posted it under the title, "Next Chapter Loading," and felt depth open inside him that hadn't been there before. He powered down the camera and turned toward the toolbox, ready to begin again. Frank woke to a dull ache at the base of his spine and a deep soreness in his shoulders, the kind that comes from working long hours bent over wiring diagrams and metal parts, but he also woke with determination humming inside him, a steady pulse reminding him why he'd chosen this path. He poured coffee, sat at the kitchen table with his worn notebook, and scribbled a list: finalize wiring, install electric conversion module, test battery charge, polish exterior trim, contact upholsterer about final fittings. He crossed off wiring immediately after breakfast, almost perfect, all connections tight, insulated, labeled. He leaned back for a moment and stared at the ceiling, thoughts drifting to Elon's voice: if things are not failing, you are not innovating enough. He nodded. He was failing sometimes: loose connectors, a wire misrouted, an electrical arc, but failing small meant adjusting, learning, moving forward. He stood and walked to the garage where Eleanor rested mid-reborn, sunlight highlighting her curves and the new coat of paint shining with intent. He plugged in the diagnostic tool and watched the lights flicker as power flowed, battery pack hummed, gauge read 24 volts. It held. It pulsed. It lived again. That sight, the digital green glow, made Frank feel more alive than he had in years. He spent the next hours routing cables neatly along channels, securing panels, tightening clamps and torquing bolts where needed. He talked to the old insulation foam inside his sleeve the way people speak to themselves in the mirror: firm and steady, this is real. You deserve this. In the afternoon, Anna and the boys arrived unexpectedly early, carrying sandwiches and iced tea. She crossed the garage floor quietly and stood beside him, her voice soft. Want help? He smiled and handed her a stray wire. She clipped it into place with care, her fingers steady though unfamiliar with the job. That's perfect. Another bolt slipped into place. Tyler and Charlie polished the chrome headlight bezels until they reflected the ceiling light like new coins. The kids laughed when the light flared off the metal, then ran to high-five their grandfather. For a moment, Frank froze, blinking back tears. He'd spent years isolating himself, thinking he was protecting everyone by staying quiet, but here was the proof he'd been wrong: presence mattered more than silence. Anna lingered after the boys played outside and watched as he tested the horn, polished the tailgate lettering, and emptied the vacuum one last time before starting her up. She asked him how he felt and he paused, breathing deep. Bruised. Tired. But also ready. They talked about the conference. She said she'd never seen him so alive. He said he finally got a second chance at who he was. She hugged him and said she was proud. Later that evening, Frank rewatched the footage he'd recorded earlier, shots of wiring channels, close-ups of the EV badge, the boys high-fiving, Anna's quiet pride. He edited it into a video he titled "Pain and Progress." He spoke over it: every step forward costs something. Pain isn't a sign you're broken, it's proof you're building again. He uploaded and posted. Not 30 minutes later, comments flooded in. That was the most honest thing I've ever seen. My hands shake from chemotherapy. But today I measured a drawer for a shelf project. Thank you for acknowledging the ache. Because it's real. So is this. One comment included a photo of a woman's hands, older and scarred, tightening a screw on an old bike she'd reassembled. Another writer said she'd pulled her husband's old golf clubs out of the garage and promised to learn to play together again. Frank handled these messages carefully, as though they were too precious to drop. He replied gently. He felt the weight of each one, each project, each dream reignited. That night he slept early, bones tired but spirit lit. In his dreams he heard the echo of the garage, metal tapping, bolts tightening, applause from voices on a screen. It felt like a lullaby, not a broadcast. The next day, he scheduled a call with the nonprofit event organizers to help them finalize his speaking points, audio-visual needs, and whether he'd want an online component. When he hung up, he felt a bubble of nerves. But it wasn't fear. It was anticipation. He realized fear was just a story he told himself when hope was too quiet. And hope, deliberate, daily hope, was now louder. He spent another day prepping, rehearsing points, recording practice clips, making sure he wore the shirt he felt good in, not for anyone but himself. Mid-afternoon, he stepped back to look at Eleanor in full light, the license plate reading Meredith, after the lake, gleaming, the battery tightly secured, the truck resting on new tires. It looked like a vehicle built with intention, not just nostalgia. He remembered Elon's offer for help and sent a message. Could they schedule a video call next week to discuss specifics of converting it to fully electric? The reply came almost immediately, absolutely. Excited to help. Frank smiled. Exhaustion returned, but this time it felt earned. Real. Good. On the drive to bed, he carried a sense of forward motion inside him, a quiet engine starting after being silent for years. He thought about the truth about aging they never told him, that the body slows, yes. But the soul doesn't have an expiration. The truck wasn't finished. Eleanor still needed final calibration, upholstery trimmed, badges placed. But she was alive. And so was he. One more entry in the notebook, test drive Sunday afternoon, if weather holds. He taped it to the workbench and shut the door, leaving the light on above Eleanor. The day had been built, pain, progress, presence. The next lay open. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The sun had just begun its slow climb over the horizon when Frank stepped outside into the crisp morning air, the sky painted with soft pastels, lavender bleeding into peach, the promise of a new day reflected in every breath. The garage door stood open, and there, under the gentle wash of dawn light, Eleanor waited like an old friend reborn, her coat freshly polished, the new EV badge gleaming softly. Frank's heart thudded in a rhythm that wasn't just from the morning chill. It was the thrum of possibility. Today was the day he'd promised himself, the test drive. He slid into the driver's seat, the worn leather warm beneath his fingers, the familiar scent of aged wood and oil mixing with the faint tang of fresh electronics. He ran a hand across the steering wheel, tracing the curves and bumps, a tactile connection to years and memories and now a future. His fingers rested over the ignition button. No key turned, just a soft press, and the dashboard lit with a futuristic glow. The hum was quiet, almost reverent, a new heartbeat pulsing through Eleanor's veins. He released the brake and eased onto the quiet street, the wheels rolling smooth and sure. The familiar rumble of gas was gone, replaced by a subtle, electric whisper. As he drove through the sleepy town, Frank felt the eyes of early risers watching, heads peeking from curtains, neighbors stepping outside with mugs of coffee. A few nodded, others smiled, recognizing the old truck with a new spirit. Frank caught his reflection in a storefront window and almost didn't recognize the man behind the glass, an older gentleman, sure, but with eyes clear and steady, a posture straighter than it had been in years. The test drive wasn't just about Eleanor's new engine or the miles she could cover, it was a test of Frank himself, his courage to start again, to believe change was still possible. He cruised down Main Street, past the diner where he and Anna had celebrated their 50th anniversary, past the park bench where he used to watch the boys play, past the library that smelled like pine wood and paperbacks. Somewhere in those familiar sights, the old Frank was folding into the new. Halfway through the route, a sudden jolt startled him, a small wobble in the steering. He pulled over to the curb, heart quickening. Opening the hood, he examined the wiring harnesses, the battery mounts, the connections. A loose bolt. Nothing catastrophic, but a reminder that even the best laid plans could stumble. He tightened the bolt with his wrench, breath steadying, reminding himself, progress was never perfect. He closed the hood and got back behind the wheel, starting again with a cautious smile. Back on the road, the hum returned steady, the truck responding like a loyal companion. He drove toward the overlook, the place where he'd first dreamed of this project, the place where Anna's message had sparked the fire inside him. The sun was higher now, warming his face, the world stretching open in all directions. He parked and stepped out, breathing deep. The wind carried scents of pine and fresh earth, the rustle of leaves whispering ancient encouragement. He pulled out his phone and filmed a short clip. Eleanor's first real test drive. We hit a bump and fixed it. That's life, sometimes rough, but worth it. Keep building. He posted it immediately. Messages came fast, congratulations, questions about the conversion, offers of help, stories of their own second chances. Frank smiled, feeling the ripple effect. But the day wasn't done. Driving home, he caught sight of a group of teenagers gathered around a beat-up pickup truck on the corner, struggling with a flat tire. Without thinking, he pulled over. "Need a hand?" he asked, stepping out. They looked surprised but grateful. Together, they jacked up the truck, removed the tire, replaced it with the spare. The boy in the group asked about Eleanor's quiet hum, and Frank shared a quick explanation of electric conversion. The kids listened, fascinated, asking questions. The moment felt like a bridge between generations, a silent passing of the torch. Afterward, Frank drove home, tired but exhilarated, realizing that the test drive had been more than just miles on the odometer, it was connection, learning, courage, and renewal all rolled into one. That night, he lay in bed, muscles aching but spirit light, thinking about Elon's words, "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." He whispered into the darkness, "It is important. I'm doing it." Tomorrow would bring new challenges, no doubt. But today, he'd driven forward, not just Eleanor, but himself. The truth about aging they never told him. It wasn't about slowing down. It was about finding new roads to travel. Frank woke before dawn, the weight of the upcoming conference settling on his chest like an old familiar ache, nerves mixed with hope, the kind of tension that hums beneath every second chance. He dressed slowly, choosing the blue button-down shirt Anna had bought him for his birthday, the one he hadn't dared wear out yet. He ran a hand over the creases, then glanced at the mirror and saw not just a man with silver hair and weathered hands, but someone who had fought through years of silence to reach this moment. The drive to Chicago was quiet, the highway stretching wide under early morning light. His mind replayed his speech, the story he'd rehearsed in the garage so many times. He thought about Elon's voice echoing in his head, "People who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do." Was he crazy enough? He hoped so. Arriving at the conference center, Frank was greeted by volunteers and organizers who treated him like a star. It was a far cry from the lonely garages and quiet days spent tinkering alone. The auditorium was packed, rows of chairs filled with faces marked by time and stories of their own. As he walked on stage under the bright lights, the crowd hushed, eyes fixed on him like he was a beacon in a storm. He began simply, telling his story, falling, feeling forgotten, the spark from Elon's words, the decision to convert Eleanor into something new, the journey of rediscovery. He spoke of pain, progress, and presence, weaving in the voices of the people who had reached out through his videos. As he spoke, he saw nods, smiles, even tears. He realized he wasn't just telling his story. He was giving permission for others to tell theirs. After the speech, people swarmed him, old women clutching their knitting bags, veterans with steady eyes, young caregivers with tired smiles, each sharing their own dreams paused or forgotten. One woman, 77, said she'd always wanted to learn to paint again but never thought she had the time or talent. Another man, 68, told Frank he'd been rebuilding classic motorcycles but had given up after his wife passed. Frank listened, offering words of encouragement, sharing his belief that it was never too late. Outside, a reporter approached him for a quick interview. The questions were familiar. What inspired you? What advice do you have for those who feel too old to start? Frank smiled, answering honestly that the hardest part was giving yourself permission. Permission to fail. Permission to try. Permission to matter. That night, back in his hotel room, Frank recorded a short video reflecting on the day. Standing here, I feel the weight of all the stories I've heard and the hope they carry. Aging isn't an ending, it's a crossing, between what was and what can still be. We just have to keep walking. He posted the video with a hashtag that caught fire, #NeverTooLate. Messages poured in again, but this time with faces and voices attached. People shared photos of projects restarted, dances learned, letters written to estranged family. Frank felt the ripple turn into a wave. The next morning, before heading home, he took a walk through a nearby park, watching families and couples, the elderly and the young mingling on benches and paths. He realized that life wasn't about holding on to youth, but about embracing change and crossing the lines we set for ourselves. Back in his garage, Eleanor waited patiently, wires humming softly. Frank pulled out his tools and got back to work, knowing this was only the beginning. The truth about aging? It's not about losing ground, it's about finding new terrain. Frank sat at the kitchen table, the soft hum of the refrigerator blending with the morning birds outside his window. His eyes lingered on the screen of his phone, where a new message had arrived overnight, one that would shift everything. It was from Tyler, his eldest grandson. "Grandpa, I watched your video from the conference. I'm proud of you. I want to learn more about Eleanor. Can we work on it together this summer?" Frank's throat tightened. For years, Tyler had been distant, caught up in college and work, always too busy or too distracted for visits. The silence between them had been a quiet ache, a reminder that some bridges seemed too far to cross. But here was a light breaking through. He replied immediately, "Would love that, Tyler. Let's make it a project." Over breakfast, Anna noticed his quiet smile and nudged gently, "What's the good news?" He showed her the message, feeling a warmth that had little to do with coffee. That afternoon, Frank called Tyler. Their conversation was tentative at first, the awkwardness of long-lost connection, but quickly warmed as they talked about Eleanor, the electric conversion, and shared memories of times past. Tyler asked questions about batteries and motors, his curiosity sparking a flame Frank thought had died. Over the next weeks, plans formed. Tyler would come home for the summer. They'd work side by side in the garage, not just fixing Eleanor, but rebuilding their bond. As word spread, neighbors and friends offered parts, tools, and encouragement. The garage became a workshop of not only metal and wire but hope and reconciliation. One afternoon, Tyler showed up with a stack of books about electric vehicles and engineering, eager to learn. Frank, though rusty on some technical jargon, found himself energized by the challenge, diving into new ideas with a hunger that surprised him. They stayed late into evenings, laughing over mistakes and celebrating small victories, battery tests, motor calibrations, the gentle purr when Eleanor's systems came alive. It wasn't just a truck being rebuilt, it was a relationship. One day, Tyler pulled out his phone and played a clip of Elon Musk talking about innovation, risk, and the power of persistence. "This guy never gave up," Tyler said. Frank nodded, "Neither should we." Their work soon attracted attention beyond the family. Local news ran a story about the grandfather-grandson project, and viewers responded with messages of support, stories of their own family reconnections, and newfound hopes. Frank found himself invited to speak at community centers and schools, sharing not just technical lessons but life lessons, about age, change, and the courage to try. One evening, after a long day of welding and wiring, Frank sat with Tyler on the porch, watching the sunset bleed orange and pink across the sky. Tyler said quietly, "I'm glad I came back." Frank reached out and squeezed his hand, feeling the truth in those words. The message that changed everything wasn't just on a screen, it was in the hands building, the hearts reconnecting, the future unfolding. Aging, Frank realized, was never about closing doors but opening them wide enough for the next generation to walk through with you. The first time Frank read the comments on his latest video, he was ready for praise, but what he found was something else: doubt, skepticism, and even outright criticism. Why bother? At your age, isn't it time to just slow down? One comment read. Another, this is cute, but it won't change the real world. Frank felt the sting deep in his chest, a familiar old voice whispering, maybe they're right. For a moment, he considered giving up the channel, the project, even the whole idea of pushing forward. But then he remembered something Elon Musk had said during a podcast he'd listened to just weeks before: when something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. That phrase echoed louder than the doubts. He took a deep breath and decided he wouldn't let the cynics define his story. Instead, he recorded a new video titled, Facing Doubts and Critics, where he shared the raw truth about the fear of failure, the pain of judgment, and the power of persistence. I'm not perfect, he said plainly. I'm learning. I'm failing. But I'm here. And if I can inspire even one person to try, then the critics can have their say. The video struck a chord with many. Messages of solidarity poured in from people who felt silenced or invisible, stories of their own battles with doubt and the courage it took to keep going. Some admitted they'd never dared to start something new because they were afraid of what others would think. Others shared how Frank's honesty gave them permission to fail without shame. One woman, a retired teacher, wrote that she had always dreamed of writing a novel but had been paralyzed by the fear of judgment. After watching Frank's video, she'd begun her first chapter. Frank realized that criticism, though painful, was a kind of test, a gatekeeper to deeper commitment. He learned to listen to constructive feedback and let go of the noise that didn't serve him. At a local community meeting, Frank was asked about the backlash. He spoke openly about the voices inside his own head, the ones telling him to quit, and how Elon's mindset gave him the courage to fight back. The room filled with nods, some tears. People related. They understood the universal battle between fear and hope. Over the next weeks, Frank doubled down on his efforts. More videos, more community engagement, more connection. He invited viewers to share their own stories of doubt and how they overcame it. Slowly, a movement formed around the idea that aging was not a limitation but a launching pad for new ventures. Meanwhile, Tyler and Frank continued working on Eleanor. They hit snags, of course, a battery overheating, wiring issues, but each problem became a lesson in resilience. Tyler once joked, if Elon can handle rockets exploding, we can handle a truck that won't start. Their laughter was a bomb. Frank's relationship with his family grew stronger too. Anna's quiet support remained a constant, and the boys often stopped by with their own projects, inspired by their grandfather's example. One afternoon, Frank received an email from a startup interested in collaborating on sustainable transportation for seniors. The sender mentioned how Frank's story had inspired their team to think differently about innovation and aging. Frank smiled, amazed at how far the ripples had spread. Yet, through it all, he stayed grounded in the garage, working on Eleanor, on himself, on the future. He understood that change wasn't a single moment but a series of small steps, taken with courage and compassion. The truth about aging? It was messy, challenging, and beautiful. And no matter the critics, it was his story to tell, and rewrite, every day. The knock on Frank's door came just as he was wiping grease off his hands, the fading light outside casting long shadows across the garage. He opened it to find a young woman holding a letter with a polished seal, her eyes bright and hopeful. Mr. Roberts. I'm Claire from the City Council. We've been following your project and your story. We'd like to invite you to speak at the upcoming Innovation in Aging Summit. Frank blinked, disbelief and surprise swirling inside him. A summit? In the city? With experts, entrepreneurs, and maybe even policymakers. The thought was overwhelming but thrilling. Over the next few days, Frank's mind raced as he prepared. He pored over his past videos, speeches, and notes, trying to find the words that would honor his journey and the journeys of everyone who had shared theirs with him. He practiced pacing his speech, working to balance vulnerability with strength, honesty with hope. The night before the event, he sat on the porch with Anna, who squeezed his hand and said, "You're going to inspire them, just like you inspired me." The next morning, stepping onto the stage in a room filled with faces both curious and expectant, Frank felt the familiar rush of nerves tempered by purpose. He began with the moment that changed everything, the night he heard Elon Musk say, "You have to be willing to be misunderstood if you're going to innovate." He told them about Eleanor's transformation, the doubts, the family reconnecting, and the critics who challenged him. But most of all, he spoke about what aging meant to him now, not an end, but a new chapter full of possibility. The audience responded with applause, questions, and shared stories. Afterward, several attendees approached Frank with ideas, partnerships, and offers to help scale his project, hoping to make electric vehicle conversions accessible for seniors everywhere. One entrepreneur spoke of designing easy-to-use tech for older drivers, inspired by Frank's story. Another policymaker talked about grants for community-based innovation projects. Frank felt a sense of validation, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever felt overlooked. The summit became a turning point. Frank's story gained wider attention, featured in local news, podcasts, and social media. More importantly, it sparked conversations about what it means to grow older in a society obsessed with youth. That night, back in his quiet home, Frank sat by the window watching stars blink into the dark sky. He thought about Elon's fearless drive, the spark that had ignited in his own heart, and the unexpected invitation that had opened a new door. He realized that sometimes, the universe listens when you dare to start, and when you keep going, it will surprise you. The truth about aging. It's not just about holding on or letting go, it's about showing up, boldly, for whatever comes next. Frank stared out the window at the fading autumn leaves swirling in the chilly breeze. The excitement from the summit was still alive, but beneath it simmered a quieter, deeper challenge, the fragile bridge between him and his son, David. Their relationship had been strained for years, frayed by missed birthdays, harsh words, and silent dinners. David's last visit had been 6 months ago, a brief and tense encounter that left Frank wondering if forgiveness was even possible. The invitation from Tyler to rebuild Eleanor together had sparked hope in Frank's heart, but he knew healing with his son would require more than shared projects, it required trust. One afternoon, Frank decided to call David. The line rang twice before a gruff voice answered, "Dad." The single word carried years of distance and guarded pain. "David, I know I haven't been the father you deserved. I want to try to change that. Would you come by for coffee this week?" There was a long pause, then a reluctant, "Okay." The day of the visit, Frank prepared nervously, cleaning the living room, making sure Anna was around to keep things light. When David arrived, their greeting was awkward, a mix of hesitation and old habits. Over coffee, Frank listened more than he talked, letting David voice the disappointments and frustrations that had built up. For the first time, Frank didn't try to defend himself but acknowledged the hurt. "I'm sorry I wasn't there when you needed me. I'm trying to be better." David's eyes softened. "I want that too, Dad. I miss us." Over the weeks, their conversations grew longer, more honest. David began to ask about Eleanor, the electric truck, and Frank's new outlook on life. He admitted he had been skeptical but was starting to understand. One afternoon, David showed up in the garage with a toolbox and a wry smile. "Thought I'd help with the wiring." Frank's heart lifted. Together, they worked side by side, the hum of tools blending with tentative laughter. The garage became their shared space, not just for fixing Eleanor but for mending what had been broken. At night, Frank thought about Elon Musk's resilience, the way he had weathered failure after failure without giving up. It reminded him that relationships, like projects, needed patience, perseverance, and a willingness to face hard truths. Slowly, Frank and David began to build new memories, ones that didn't erase the past but added layers of healing and hope. The truth about aging, Frank realized, wasn't just about physical reinvention, it was about emotional courage, the bravery to reach across the chasms time had carved and rebuild what mattered most. The early morning sun filtered softly through the cracked blinds of Frank's workshop, casting golden slashes across the tools and spare parts scattered about. The air smelled faintly of oil and metal, a scent that had become a comfort, a reminder of purpose regained. Today was another day to chip away at Eleanor's final systems, the ones that still resisted full transformation. As Frank tightened a stubborn bolt, he thought about how far he'd come from that lonely night when Elon Musk's words had first ignited a spark inside him. It wasn't a grand leap that changed everything, but a series of small wins, each one building momentum, each one carving out new meaning. He thought about Tyler's return, the hesitant reconnection with David, the community messages, and the growing wave of encouragement. Those were victories, too, as vital as any mechanical breakthrough. Frank often reminded himself that aging didn't mean giving up control, it meant learning to harness patience and celebrate progress in its many forms. That afternoon, he recorded a video titled "The Power of Small Wins," sharing candid moments from the garage. A battery test passed, a wire correctly soldered, a circuit finally completing its loop. He spoke about the importance of recognizing every step forward, no matter how small, because each one was a declaration that the journey was still underway. The response was immediate and heartfelt. Viewers sent in stories of their own small wins, a daily walk resumed, a long-delayed call made, a hobby dusted off and tried again. Many expressed how Frank's approach helped them see that change didn't have to be overwhelming to be meaningful. One message stood out, a woman named Janet, 69, who wrote, "I started baking again after 20 years, and your story gave me the courage." Frank felt that familiar warmth, the ripple of inspiration spreading beyond his garage walls. Later that week, Frank and Tyler hit a breakthrough. Eleanor's electric motor purred smoothly for the first time. The hum was soft but powerful, a sound that echoed hope. They high-fived, their smiles wide and genuine, the bond between them stronger for shared success and shared struggle. That evening, Frank sat with Anna on the porch, the cool breeze whispering through the trees. He reflected on how small wins had transformed not just his project, but his spirit. They had built a ladder out of doubt and fear, rung by rung, leading him back to life's possibilities. Elon's journey was no different, facing one challenge after another, refusing to quit even when the odds were stacked. Aging, Frank realized, was less about the number of years and more about the willingness to keep trying, keep winning, no matter how incremental. It was a daily act of courage, a promise to oneself to never stop building, learning, and dreaming. Frank felt the familiar flutter in his chest as he stood before the packed room at the senior center, ready to share his story once again. It was a mixture of excitement and nerves, a tension he recognized as the crossroads where fear met purpose. Just months ago, he never would have imagined speaking in front of dozens of strangers about his journey from despair to rediscovery. Yet here he was, a man transformed by small wins, new connections, and the quiet wisdom that age had brought him. He began with a simple question: what if everything you believed about getting old was wrong? The room fell silent, the question hanging like a challenge in the air. Frank shared the moments that had shattered his old narrative. The years of regret, the doubts whispered by family and society, and then the spark ignited by Elon Musk's relentless refusal to accept limits. He spoke candidly about fear, the paralyzing, suffocating kind that tries to hold us back, and how purpose, once found, can push through even the darkest doubts. Fear is not the enemy, Frank said, it's a signal that something important is on the line. When you feel it, don't run. Lean in. Use it to fuel your journey. He told the story of Eleanor's transformation, the late nights in the garage, the fragile moments of progress, and the deepening relationships with his family. He shared how every small step forward felt like a rebellion against the assumptions of age and invisibility. The audience listened intently, some nodding, others wiping tears. After the talk, many approached Frank, sharing their own fears and hopes. An elderly woman spoke softly about losing her husband and feeling lost in the silence of her house. A retired mechanic told how he'd stopped dreaming after a stroke but now wanted to build model airplanes again. A man in his 70s said Frank's story reminded him it was never too late to write the novel he'd always imagined. Frank realized then that purpose wasn't a destination, it was a beacon, a flame that could light the path even when the road was uncertain. Fear would always be there, but purpose gave it meaning and direction. Later, as he packed up his things, Frank reflected on Elon Musk's mindset, the fearless pursuit of a vision despite setbacks and criticism. He understood that courage was not the absence of fear but the choice to move forward anyway. Aging was not a retreat but a powerful call to live fully, with passion and intention. That night, Frank lay in bed, heart full. He knew the journey was far from over, but he was no longer afraid. With purpose guiding him, every challenge became an opportunity, every doubt a chance to grow. Frank woke to the soft glow of dawn spilling through his kitchen window, the quiet hum of the neighborhood stirring to life outside. He poured himself a cup of coffee, the rich aroma grounding him as he scrolled through messages on his phone. Overnight, his latest video, where he spoke openly about fear meeting purpose, had gone viral within his circle and beyond. Comments from strangers poured in, people inspired, moved, and energized by his words. Many shared their own stories of late-in-life transformations, small victories, and newfound dreams. Some thanked him for giving them permission to believe change was still possible. Frank felt a surge of gratitude and responsibility. His journey was no longer just his own, it had become a spark lighting others' paths. That morning, as he prepared to work in the garage, Anna handed him a letter that had arrived from a nonprofit focused on senior innovation. They invited Frank to join their advisory board to help develop programs supporting older adults in tech and entrepreneurship. The invitation was humbling, a sign that the seeds he had planted were beginning to grow into something bigger. As Frank and Tyler continued refining Eleanor's systems, they spoke often about the impact their story was having. Tyler said, "Grandpa, people need to hear that it's okay to start over, even if they think it's too late." Frank nodded, remembering the loneliness and self-doubt he'd battled just months before. He now saw those feelings as common threads woven through many lives, threads that could be unraveled with connection and courage. One afternoon, Frank received an unexpected call from a local school principal who had watched his videos. The school wanted to start a program where seniors like Frank would mentor young students in STEM and life skills. Frank felt a thrill imagining classrooms where experience and youthful energy combined to inspire new generations. It was more than a project, it was a bridge across age and time. Throughout the weeks, Frank's role in the community deepened. He gave talks at libraries, led workshops, and joined panel discussions. Each event was a reminder that his voice mattered, that his years of life had value beyond what he'd imagined. In those moments, he saw Elon Musk's spirit reflected, not in flashy headlines or fame, but in the persistent, humble work of changing minds and breaking barriers. One evening, after a particularly moving session where a young woman thanked him for encouraging her to pursue engineering despite doubts, Frank sat with Anna in the backyard. The stars above seemed to shine a little brighter, and he felt an overwhelming sense of peace. "I never thought I'd find this kind of purpose again," he said softly. Anna smiled, squeezing his hand. "You're proof it's never too late." Frank thought about the ripples his actions had caused, how a single spark, a few courageous steps, had ignited waves of change touching lives he'd never meet. He understood now that aging was not a quiet fading but a powerful force for renewal and connection. Frank stood in the middle of the community center's main hall, his hands steady but his heart pounding with a mix of nerves and excitement. Today was the day he would unveil Eleanor's full electric conversion to a crowd of friends, family, neighbors, and local officials who had followed his journey from the very beginning. It wasn't just a vehicle, it was a symbol of transformation, resilience, and hope. The same way Elon Musk's bold ventures had changed the way the world imagined technology, Frank's project had changed the way many imagined what aging could mean. As the doors opened, familiar faces filled the room, each carrying stories of their own struggles and triumphs. Anna squeezed Frank's hand, offering quiet support. Tyler gave him a thumbs up, pride shining in his eyes. David arrived unexpectedly, standing near the back with a tentative smile that spoke volumes about mended bridges. Frank took a deep breath and began. He shared the story of the first spark, Elon Musk's words about never accepting limits, the late nights in the garage, the small victories and setbacks, the doubts he wrestled with and the hope that kept him moving forward. He told them about the power of starting again, of finding purpose in unexpected places, and the courage it took to say, "I am not finished." Then came the moment the crowd had been waiting for. With Tyler's help, Frank rolled Eleanor out into the sunlight. The crowd gasped as the old truck, now sleek and silent, gleamed with a fresh coat of paint and gleaming new parts. Frank slid into the driver's seat and smiled. The motor hummed softly to life, smooth, clean, and strong. He drove Eleanor slowly around the parking lot, the hum of the electric engine a quiet anthem of reinvention. Applause erupted, but Frank's eyes searched the crowd for the quiet nods of those who had walked the path alongside him. He saw Anna's tears, Tyler's grin, David's proud expression, and strangers who looked inspired. In that moment, Frank felt a surge of gratitude for the journey, the pain, the setbacks, the doubts, and above all, the decision to keep going. After the presentation, Frank was approached by a young woman who introduced herself as a documentary filmmaker. She wanted to tell the stories of seniors challenging the limits society placed on them, starting with Frank's. The idea thrilled him, another way to amplify the message that age was not an end but a powerful beginning. Later that evening, as Frank sat on the porch watching the stars, he reflected on everything he had learned. Aging wasn't about fading away. It was about fighting for relevance, embracing change, and creating a legacy that mattered. He thought of Elon Musk's fearless spirit, a reminder that courage and vision could defy any obstacle. Frank whispered to himself, "I was never too old. I was just waiting for permission to matter again." The morning light spilled gently over the horizon as Frank sat quietly on his porch, sipping his coffee and watching the world wake around him. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and fresh earth, a reminder that every day brought new chances, new possibilities. Today wasn't just another day, it was a celebration of everything he had fought for, the transformation that had taken root deep within him. Looking out at Eleanor parked in the driveway, gleaming under the sun, humming softly with clean energy, Frank felt a surge of peace and purpose. This truck was more than metal and wires, it was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the refusal to be defined or diminished by age. He thought back to the moment it all changed, that night when Elon Musk's fearless words pierced through his doubt and inertia. "You have to be willing to be misunderstood if you're going to innovate." Those words had been a spark, but it was his own courage, step by step, day by day, that fanned the flame into a blaze. Frank smiled, remembering the long road, the loneliness, the regrets, the broken bridges he dared to rebuild, the small wins that became milestones, and the unexpected invitations that expanded his world. Each chapter of his journey had been a struggle and a gift, leading him here, to a place where age was not a cage but a key. He reached for his phone and opened a new message draft. This one wasn't a technical update or a request for help. It was a note to the community he had grown to love, the people who had watched, listened, and shared their own stories. To everyone who ever thought it was too late, keep going. Your story is still being written. You matter. You are the future. Anna came out, her eyes bright with warmth and pride. "Ready to take Eleanor for a spin?" she asked, playful and sincere. Frank nodded, standing and stretching with a renewed vigor that surprised even him. Together, they climbed into the truck, the cabin filled with the quiet hum of possibility. As they drove down familiar roads, Frank saw neighbors waving, children playing, and the world moving forward just as he was. He realized that the greatest truth Elon Musk had embodied wasn't just innovation or technology, it was the relentless drive to push beyond limits, to imagine a better tomorrow, and to keep moving no matter the odds. Frank understood now that aging was not an ending but a new beginning, a chance to live with intention, courage, and love. He was no longer waiting for permission to matter. He was living it. And in that, he knew, lay the real truth about aging they never told him, but Elon Musk's example had helped him find: it's never too late to change, to dream, to create, and to inspire. Frank smiled as the road stretched ahead, open and bright, ready for whatever came next. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?